All right, guys, we are on day one of our coronavirus social distancing math activities, and we are talking about inverse functions. Now, inverse functions is the unit we just finished, so hopefully this is still a little bit of review for you. Inverse functions, fresh on your mind. When we find inverses, what we're trying to do is undo things that have already been done. So if we have a function, f of x, and that function is equal to x minus 7 quantity squared plus 6. If we have that function, we are going to try to undo to x everything that this function is doing. When we find the inverse, we're going to use inverse function notation. So this is not a -1 power. This indicates the inverse. F inverse of x. That's what we're doing. Now, when we find the inverse algebraically, it goes back to everything that you did in middle school with inverse operations. Anytime you want to isolate a variable, you have to get rid of what's with it. How do you get rid of addition? With the inverse operation. You subtract. How do you get rid of multiplication? Again, with its inverse operation. So you divide. And vice versa. To get rid of subtraction, you add. To get rid of division, you multiply. Now, if we are going with inverse operation of a power, so if we have a second power, like this, squared, we can either raise it to the 1/2 power, the reciprocal power, especially if we have a fractional power, or we can take the square root. So to get rid of a cubed, we could either raise it to the 1/3 power, or we could take the cube root, and vice versa. If we want to get rid of a square root, we would have to square it. To get rid of a cube root, we would have to cube it. And if we had a function, say x to the 5/2 power, we would have to raise it to the reciprocal power. So the reciprocal of 5/2 would be 2/5. And that would get rid of your power to isolate the variable. So when we find inverse functions, what we're doing is we're looking for a function that is going to undo this function. Meaning if you plug a function into its inverse, if you were to replace the x with the original function, it would simply cancel out. It would get rid of all the operations that were done, and you would be left with x. So in order to find the inverse function algebraically, our big idea on this whole unit on inverses is we want to switch the x and y. F of x means the same thing basically as y, and so we have y equals the quantity x minus 7 squared plus 6. Now, in order to find the inverse algebraically, we're going to switch the x and the y. So everywhere I see the y, I'm going to replace it with x. Everywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with y. So now we have x equals y minus 7 quantity squared plus 6. Now we're going back to middle school. We're going to do the order of operations in reverse to undo math and isolate a variable. When we do math, we follow the order of operations, PEMDAS. When we undo math, we have to follow it in reverse. So if we have our order of operations, parentheses, and other grouping symbols, exponents, multiplication and division from left to right, addition and subtraction from left to right, we're going to follow these in reverse. So the first thing we're going to get rid of is addition and subtraction. Now, this subtraction is inside of a grouping symbol, parentheses. That means we have to wait until the end to get rid of it. Moving on, we have another addition, and so we will get rid of the addition using the inverse operation of addition, which is subtraction. We will subtract 6. Now, once we do the inverse operation, we have to follow the golden rule of algebra, which says, do unto one side of the equal sign what you just did unto the other. Now, we don't want to subtract 6 here because that's not the other side of the equal sign. We go to the equal sign and subtract 6. So we have x minus 6 is equal to, the equal sign stays in the same place, y minus 7 quantity squared. Again, this minus 7 is inside grouping symbols, so we can't get rid of it next. There is no multiplication and division, and so we move on to exponents. To get rid of a squared, we do its inverse operation, which is take the square root of both sides. And so we're given the square root of x minus 6 is equal to y minus 7. The square root and the squared, since they are inverse operations, they negate one another. Lastly, we have y minus 7, and to get rid of subtraction, we do addition, which tells me our inverse function, our final answer, f inverse of x, will be equal to 7 plus the square root of x minus 6. We found our inverse algebraically using the big idea that to find the inverse, we switch x and y. And then we solve algebraically just like you've been doing since middle school. All right, the second way that we're going to be solving for inverse functions is we are going to be solving graphically. Now remember, our big idea when finding the inverse of a function is what? We switch x and y. The same thing works with a graph, especially if you have coordinates that you have access to. The inverse of a function, we switch x and y. In this case, we've got a coordinate, and this is the coordinate 3, 0. 3 over, 0 up. Here we have a coordinate 0, 9. 0 over, 9 up. So the easiest way to find the inverse of a function, or to find the graph of an inverse of a function, is going to be to switch the x and y values. We're going to switch 3, 0, and we're going to plot it as 0, 3. 0 over, 3 up. 0, 3. Then we're going to do the same thing with 9, 0, or 0, 9, and we're going to switch the x and y, and we are going to plot 9, 0, switching the x and the y. This gives us our inverse function. Now, what I want you to note about this is that another way we can do it if we don't have access to the x and y values is that we can reflect over the line y is equal to x. The line y is equal to x, meaning the points 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, etc. If we look, our inverse is simply reflected, just like a mirror, over the line y equals x. This point, reflected over the line y equals x, results in 9, 0. So two easy ways to find the inverse from a graph. The first is if you have access to coordinates, simply switch your x and y. The second would be to draw your line y equals x and then reflect it. Big ideas about finding the inverse of a function, switch the x and y. All right, guys, try your work. You've got 11 questions, I believe, on your homework worksheet. Day 1, inverse functions. Remember, if you have questions, you can comment underneath this video, and I'll be able to answer your questions. All right, guys, I hope you enjoy your day. Don't forget to do your work. Improvise, adapt, overcome. We've got a challenge. We just have to overcome.